If you're like me, then you really love the alien ships of Star Citizen. Each one is a combination of a multidisciplinary team of incredible creatives, dreaming up species, cultures, and the tools they use. And as one of the most detail-oriented games in history, each one is a story told through that design. And while, of course, it's natural that the big baddies would have the greatest variety, if you're more a fan of the slightly more friendly alien races, then the Xi'an have you covered. They have the most ships that are on the roadmap. You've got K2L Light Fighter, the Nox Speeder Bike, Santok Yai Medium Fighter, and teased at CitizenCon, some sort of medium transport. But what if I were to tell you that there was a fifth Xi'an ship that was on the public timeline, discussed by CAG devs over a number of years, and then quietly removed? A ship that may be unique in being repeatedly confirmed as in active development, only to quietly disappear from view. This is the strange story of the Xi'an Volper Bomber. The Xi'an were introduced in October 2012 as a highly militarised imperial absolute monarchy, an old enemy of the UEE, a current tentative friend, and a credible future threat. While the Vandal were always going to be the initial villains, this was something that could potentially be a real threat in the future because every single member of their species was supposed to be militarily trained and they had much more advanced technology. It would be almost an entire year before we'd hear anything about any Xi'an ships. In the $21 million letter from the chairman, Chris Roberts revealed this concept for a Xi'an scout, and when that milestone was reached 9 days later with 24 million, the K2L was unlocked. Jump forward another 12 months to October 2014, and producer Travis Day was creating a post about the ship pipeline as it then stood. And at the end of what he described as his dissertation, he put a table of all the ships that were currently in development and where they were in the pipeline. But fans were quick to notice that amongst the expected cutlasses and constellations, there were 3 entries that hadn't been seen before: a new Corvette, the Manticore, and the Xi'an Volper. To give you a full picture of the ship we're discussing, I'm going to bring together all the details about the design itself, and then we'll go through the timeline of how that information came out, which might give you an insight into whether the ship has a future. The Volper was intended as a bomber, something that would sit slightly higher than a Gladiator, but not quite as big as Retaliator. It was compared to the Star Wars Y-Wing. It was intended to have more than one crew, and it was been mostly associated with this particular artwork by Elijah McNeil, which has 2 cockpits in a vertical flying wing design. It is strongly associated with Xi'an military might, and that was always a question about whether we'd be allowed something so powerful, and it's often pictured alongside things like concepts for Xi'an capital ships or their main cities. The Volper certainly did remain in the mind of the community and on the development slate. In 2015, it was mentioned no fewer than 5 times by devs. It was described as in concept in early April, having completed concept by late April, progressing to modelling, and to still be waiting for modelling resources by July, where it's listed in a table alongside an unannounced Xi'an transport. 2015 also brought us the Misk Reliant, which is the design which comes closest to it in the released ships, being a vertical flying wing design with 2 vertically oriented pilots. Alongside these development updates, there was an ongoing conversation about whether the ship would ever be released to us, the fans, at least before Squadron 42 came out. Travis Day expressed regret, saying that we would probably never get to play with it, whereas Ben Lesnick in a tweet said that it was still kind of up in the air, and that the decision would be made based on what made sense within the lore of the game. It is supposed to be a Xi'an military ship after all. The last word on that was that a Volper sale was TBD. Past 2015, I can't find any mention on the Volper from the people working on the ship itself or the people charged with telling us about what's being worked on. However, there are a couple more mentions in lore articles. The portfolio on Alpoa, the manufacturer of the Volper and other Xi'an ships, was published in 2016 and mentions the Volper Bomber twice, specifically in those terms. It's mentioned as the first place where we saw the Alpoa logo, and it's also mentioned as maybe one day we'll get to see humans piloting Volper bombers, kind of implying that at the moment in lore that wasn't going to be the case. Finally, in May 2017, Dave Haddock, during an episode of Lawmaker's Guide to the Galaxy, is talking about the Relas system and recognising the concept art of ship and says he thinks that's the Volper, but he's not sure. That's the last mention I can find from any dev about the Volper. What's conspicuous about that absence is that over the next couple of years there was a lot of Xi'an content. We had a 100-page language guide that went into loads of things about their lore and culture. We had explanations of where the names came from for the Katual. We had the Nox launch, we had the Santok Yai launch, and all of those came with lots of lore articles about Alpoa and about the things they make, none of which mentions the Volper anymore. So that's a very conspicuous absence that is potentially deliberate. But the story doesn't end there. What I've shown you so far is all stuff that's through very prominent channels, mostly official channels, but there's a couple more things that we maybe weren't meant to see and that most people perhaps didn't see. In January 2016, during an episode of Around the Verse, concept artist Gary Sanchez appears to accidentally switch to the wrong tab on his computer while filming a segment, and this tab doesn't seem relevant, but it is relevant to our discussion. He revealed some pictures that were helping him with some concept work. On one side there was lots of sports cars and sports bikes and various shapes, and on the left, in a box marked current ships, there was the Katual, a transport ship that's been leaked from Squadron 42, and this ship, which appears to perhaps be the Volper. We now know that Gary is working on the Nox, which makes that reference material all make sense in retrospect. That would mean that at least as late as January 2016, it was still considered an important enough thing to inform future Xi'an ship design. And finally, we must return to the beginning. That 2014 post with all these unusual ships in it, that was an accident. Later that day, Travis Day, the producer who posted that article, sat down with Citizen Ed, who now runs the Rising Star network, to have a fan interview, and I've linked the entire interview in the footnotes of this. In this interview, he revealed that had actually been an accident where he'd copied a table from an internal wiki that included these ships that were never meant to be announced at that point. The new Corvette was just a placeholder to remind them to replace the Idris, which had been upgraded. That probably became the Polaris. The Manticore was a ship that was just for Squadron 42, like several other have been. And the Volper, that was a bit more up in the air, but that's where we get the details about it maybe being like a Y-wing. And again, it was implied that maybe that was just being made for Squadron 42. That's all the information I can find. There's no mention on Spectrum that I can find. There's nothing on Reddit. It doesn't appear that there's been any other official word on the matter. This leads me to one of two possible conclusions, and it's up to you which one you end up believing. One is that the Volper still exists, it went through development, and it's being held in reserve for Squadron 42. We've been told many times that there'll be ships that we experience for the first time while playing that game. It makes perfect sense that they want to preserve a bit of novelty for an exciting single-player adventure. And the second possibility is that the Volper is a relic of a different time and a slightly different game to the one that is in development now. The idea of a multi-crew bomber certainly fit with the warlike Xi'an of 2012, but by 2017 they'd developed into a very different concept. They'd shifted away from being an absolute monarchy and towards being a system of great houses all jostling and vying for control under a still powerful but much more limited emperor. Instead of every adult member of the species being trained as a soldier, a lot were now being trained as civil service bureaucrats, although they all still had to do some service to the emperor. And rather than just being a brute force military power, they were now being framed in terms of their powers of subterfuge and diplomacy. While they certainly still have a very powerful military and can project a fuck around and find out attitude to all potential aggressors, the idea of something as simply aggressive as a bomber doesn't really fit with that doctrine. And while you certainly wouldn't throw one away if you've already developed it, it's certainly not something you would go to if you're going from concept now. It's also somewhat unlikely that if that ship that we have seen was actually modelled back then, that it would actually be useful now. The metrics have changed quite significantly since then. The Xi'an design guide has emphasised transformation, which we hadn't seen to be attributed to the Volper yet, and it doesn't seem likely that with the dual cockpit design having now gone to the Banu instead, that is something that we would retain in a Xi'an ship. So even if it were to come out, it probably wouldn't resemble the concept art that we have seen. We might see the Volper again, we might not. I'd be perfectly happy to play around with it, but if it's decided it's not in keeping with the game they want to make today, then there's no reason to keep it. We shouldn't be held hostage to the design decisions of the past when they get in the way of us advancing the design decisions of today, particularly if there's not too much sunk cost in it. So this was the story of the Volper. I'd love to hear your take, or if you've got any other further information, further comments to offer up. Do you want to see a ship like that? Personally, I'm looking forward to the non-combat alien ships. I've been your host Jael. Please do like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more weird content. I like to go into some very strange topics on my channel. If you enjoy that, then this is the place for you. Until the next time, see you in the verse.